I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. Today on the show, I'm talking to Steve Swasey. He's got a fascinating career as a senior communications leader, stops including Netflix, PeopleSoft, and Lending Club. He's currently at Red Ventures. Now, you've probably never heard of Red Ventures, but you have heard of some of the brands they own, like CNET, Healthline, Bankrate, The Points Guy, Lonely Planet, creditcards.com, ZDNet, TV Guide, Healthgrades, Reviews.com, so many more. Steve's LinkedIn profile references his career ethos: live by HIT, humility, integrity, trust. So, Steve, my first question: where did this ethos come from? Has it been your guiding light your entire career, or did you learn to get to this point over time?
Eric, first, thanks for having me. I appreciate being on. And a real quick clarification: I'm currently a senior advisor for Red Ventures. I left the firm Healthline as vice president of communications earlier this year. Well, just last month, actually, in November. The ethos that you mentioned, humility, integrity, and trust, I think it's probably evolved over time, but I was brought up in a pretty strict family that had a lot of integrity, and honesty was a thing. I could never get away with lying. I grew up in a small town, and everybody knew my grandmother, everybody knew my father. And so if I ever did anything, outside the boundaries, my parents would hear about it, and then I would hear about it, and I was dealt with that way. So I grew up with honesty as a foundation, and always humility. We had a humble upbringing, and so I just was kind of living by that humility. And then trust, I think, has evolved even more now in the last couple of years, when it's become really divisive and trust is required. So humility, integrity, and trust, it kind of codified a number of years ago, and I've been going with that ever since.
But, the PR industry is a tough one to try to have all three of those, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, PR is the antithesis of integrity and trust, right? It's shape-shifting, it's narrative, it's manipulation, right? That's what a lot of outsiders say. But you're telling me you've been able to have this career while maintaining that ethos throughout the entire time.
Well, the good ones maintain that. There are fly-by-nights that come and go, and there are firms that come and go. You remember Enron a number of years ago had great values on its wall, but they were bilking customers and running outside the law, and their CEO ended up going to jail, and their chairman, I believe, had a heart attack before he went to jail, or vice versa. You can have the impression of being trustworthy, but going under the radar as a miscreant, or doing something with malfeasance, you get caught. At the end of the day, the truth always emerges, and anybody who's playing with the truth is going to get caught, and it's going to be harmful. There's harm along the way. So I think the great firms, the great PR companies, and the great PR people have always based their work on the ethos of trust and integrity. It's easy now when anybody can publish anything and anybody can put up a website or a podcast. It's easy to get away with not telling the truth. But as I say, it does come out. And once you lose it, you've lost it forever. So you want to make sure you keep it forever. And as I say, I came in early in the PR world, and there were great firms that were founded by people that actually created the industry. I got a lot of gray hairs, so you can tell I've been doing this for about 40 years. And that meant the people that were leading the agencies that I was working for had been in it for 40 years. So that's really the foundation of PR. As you know, it started with the Creel Committee in World War I, generating interest for being involved in World War I. And those people that were supporting the war effort went on to found great firms: John Hill for Hill and Knowlton, Carl Byer and Associates, a number of others. And they really established the industry. It did evolve to, as you say, the impression it gets. And it really doesn't help, frankly, when mass media portray PR people in one way. There's a popular show that's just been revived, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. I'm sure that the woman's a PR flack, as they say. I don't like to use that word, but that's what she's conveyed as, and that's what people think. But when you know the truth, when you know what's really being done with strategy and with an objective and a product or a service that is going to help people, then you've got the basis of doing it with humility, integrity, and trust, and that'll carry on. Unfortunately, there's the people that are going outside the rules, but they'll be caught.
Going outside the rules, you mentioned that a couple of times. You mentioned social media. How does someone with those gray hairs that's been in the business for 40 years, you're looking at a world that is very different than when you started. If you look at the 80s versus now, how do you combat falsehoods? How do you combat the negatives on behalf of your companies that you work for? Because as I guess if it was Churchill that said it or Roosevelt, it feels like from 100 years ago, they said, the lies travel faster than the truth, right? And by the time they can figure out what is reality, the message is already there. So how does someone fight that, right? Like, what are you supposed to do?
That's the big problem. And it is a huge problem for our industry because, and I think it was maybe even Abe Lincoln who said something like that. I don't know who, but I know the quote, the lies travel much faster than the truth can even get out of bed. I think it's something like that. I like that quote, not because it's something you appreciate, but it's true. You have to hold to the elements of trust where you want people to trust what you're saying is true. There was a great Speaker of the House, not to make a political comment, not because of his party or anything, but Tip O'Neill in the Reagan era said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." And that's kind of foundational. Unfortunately, now we've got alternative facts and truth isn't truth and all these things we've been hearing for the last couple of years. But if you stick to the principle of providing a product or service that is going to help consumers and you deliver it to them honestly and you own up to when you've made a mistake or when you've had some issue that has not gone according to plan, you own it. Now, the big problem we have is because we have this divisive world, we have groups on social media that are spewing misinformation. We have sites and podcasts and broadcasters who are just flat out telling lies, and they have a huge following. And I liken it to, the character in the old town hall or the town square, the raving lunatic in the corner. Nobody was listening to him because he was just a raving lunatic. But if you dressed him up and gave him a podium and put some flags behind him and gave him a little bit of an audience, others followed. And that's where we are right now. We've got our own channels that we can believe and we can trust and we listen to, and they may have no foundation in truth or in fact, but we believe them. And that's the great opportunity for PR. We have to recognize where the mistruths are and expose them. And as I say, I firmly believe that the truth always comes out. There may be a lot of pain along the way, but the truth always comes out. And I'm recalling the early 70s of the great political scandal Watergate, when a president was toppled because journalism delivered the truth. Now, you can say that people don't trust journalists and journalism. There's been conversation for the last couple of years about being the enemy of the American people. I think that's horrible. I think it's wrong. Unfortunately, some people believe it. So how do we get through it? State of the truth. State of the North Star. The North Star being, we're going to be trustworthy and we're going to deliver the truth and we're going to be doing it with integrity. And ultimately, it comes out. Now, how do we get there? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure I'm going to figure it out or anybody my generation is, but somebody will. Somebody's going to take the best of the New York Times and the best of Facebook and put them together. And you're going to have a platform that everybody trusts and everybody knows is true and everybody is validated. And it returns to a basis of confidence that people have that they're getting information that's unbiased, it's balanced, it's based on truth.
Very good answer. I was going to say you sound angry. It feels like you're disappointed about the direction that things have gone in, and maybe you're lucky that you're at the end of a 40-year stint, not at the beginning of a 40-year stint. So what do you tell someone who's younger? It's like, hey, good luck trying to figure this out. I don't know what you're going to do over the next 40 years, and I'm glad it's not me doing it.
If I appear angry, I apologize. But I'm really angry that.
No, you say it with a smile. You say it politely with humility, integrity, and trust. But I can just tell you're burning on the inside. I can see it inside, not on the screen.
Well, it is true because I cannot stand injustice. I cannot stand inequity. It just is unfair. We are all given the inalienable right to peace, prosperity, and happiness, but we don't all receive it equally. And that just makes me upset. And it angers me. And it angers me further when people are uninformed. And by meaning uninformed, they might have a lot of information, but is it verifiable information? One of the first things I ask people is, who's your source or what's your source? And if they tell me, and I'm not going to start naming names and pointing fingers, but if they tell me a specific site that is based in lies and manipulation, then you know that they're not looking at the truth. They're being spoon-fed. I saw it on YouTube and my brother-in-law agrees with me, so I'm right. Well, no. So yes, this does frustrate me, and I can get angry about it. But I try to approach it from, again, a basis of humility and integrity, where I'm not going to tear somebody down for their beliefs. I'm going to challenge them and ask them, what is your source, and can we come to an agreement that maybe there are other sources that you should look at? But what you asked is, how do I deal with and how do I coach younger folks coming up in their career? I tell them, again, what I believe is the truth. There is no greater time to be doing this because we have a huge problem and problems need to be fixed. And we've had huge problems for the eternity of mankind, and we've fixed them and we've made life better. For some, it hasn't been as good as others, but we have problems. We find ways to fix them. And right now, our climate is in the most dire position it is. And everybody's talking about it. 10 years ago, climate change was not even on the map. We haven't fixed it, but we know we have to. We've got a political situation that's really dire, and we've got people that have tried to upset and disrupt the democracy that we all hold dear. Well, we're trying to fix that. So a problem needs to be fixed, and smart people fix problems. And we've got a lot of smart people in the world, not just in the U.S. I think the epicenter of technology and innovation is right here in the U.S., in the Silicon Valley and other parts of the U.S. But there are other places in the U.S., in the world, that have tremendous technology development centers and are developing solutions that are coming to our shores, not just coming from the U.S. So smart people figure out problems, identify problems, and go about fixing them. So I tell the young people that they're in a great opportunity. It's hard right now, but we're going to figure it out and we're going to fix it.
So I was going to say, my guess is this hasn't been top of mind for that many years. This, to me, feels like a recent thing that you're talking about, because your experience, we'll ignore Red Ventures and we'll ignore Healthline Media right now, but the Lending Club, PeopleSoft, Netflix, my guess is those were pretty tame brands, right? Netflix obviously had its big growth while you were there, but were you really dealing with this kind of stuff at those brands? I think they would have stayed out of the fray.
I had dinner the other night with a friend of mine, both vaccinated, both boosted, in an outdoor cafe. So let's be clear about that. We're safe here. But I had dinner with a friend who is a former CEO. He sold his company to a mega company, and he's semi-retired and enjoying life, and happy to see that. But he said he's really happy that he's not running his company now because of the pressures on CEOs to deliver not just a product or a service that benefits their consumers, but also the social conscience and the appeasement of groups for the benefit of other groups. And he says it's the CEO's job now not just to run a company, but to run a social organization. And that's really true. I mean, you've seen Levi Strauss come out in support of gun control, which alienated a lot of their core constituents. Nike, a very strong position on Black Lives Matter, using Colin Kaepernick as their spokesperson. So companies now aren't just providing the product and services that they always have. They're having to become the social conscience for their communities and for their employees. And that's extraordinarily difficult. But we have to do it. We can't just sit on the sidelines. So to answer your question, I think all the companies mentioned, PeopleSoft, Netflix, Lending Club, Kabam, great companies in their own industries, they were all led by visionary, super smart, if not brilliant CEOs who had a strong commitment to humility, integrity, and trust. I've written about this on my LinkedIn page just recently. I updated it to include Rick Elias, who's the CEO, the co-founder and CEO of Red Ventures. And to a person, the CEOs that I've worked with, I've been extraordinarily fortunate to work with those who embody these values, humility, integrity, and trust. Regrettably, I have not worked for a woman CEO, and I'd like to, because there's some really smart ones out there. Mari Barra at GM is somebody I really admire. But the point is, I don't think any of the companies that I've worked for would have blanched in the face of this social unrest. I know that Netflix has taken a very strong position on a number of things. They've gotten hit for a couple of other issues, specifically having Dave Chappelle in their stable and promoting him when he's made some comments that have not.
What would your advice be? What would your advice be if you're still at Netflix today? How would you handle that?
Well, Dave Chappelle is an artist and he has the right to have a platform, but I would also give him a slap on the wrist and I would actually, I wouldn't just talk about his ratings and how good he is. I would talk about our commitment to the trans movement and provide, as Netflix has, finally they got to it, some disclosure on what they're doing to make the bridge to bridge the gap, as opposed to just supporting their talent.
How much of these kinds of crises do you think, if you just wait long enough, they go away? Because the news cycle is so short. Dave Chappelle's the issue, a couple months ago. A year from now, maybe it'll be forgotten even in a couple of months. Like, it's almost sort of starting to get forgotten now, because a lot of these people, especially in the entertainment world, there's something crazy that they do, and then we forget about it. Other celebrities, they do crazy stuff. How much of it do you think companies, they're too quick to act? If they just said nothing and they just hid, they can weather the storm.
Nothing goes away now. With social media, with the internet, everything is front and center all the time.
But new things become more front and center. You know what I'm
New
saying?
things yes, we have short attention spans. Yeah, we have short attention spans. The new crisis takes over and the old one, but the old one lingers. And when you have another misstep, the old one comes up as a data point.
Right.
So you have to deal with something front and center. One of the great pieces of advice I got early in my career was, when you have a crisis, set up a press room and tell the truth. And if you don't know the truth, tell everybody you're finding it, you're researching it. And I think some of I don't want to single out individual companies, but some have done it really well. We don't know all the facts right now. Think of an airline crash. We don't know all the facts right now, but we're getting them, and here are the sources we're getting them from. Let the media help find some of the answers. There's a great case study from American Airlines. A friend of mine, a former head of communications there, Tim Doak, was involved during 9/11. He was the head communications guy at American Airlines. He could not actually talk, and I'm saying that this is based on what he's published publicly. He's disclosed it publicly, but he couldn't talk to the media because the FAA had taken control. But the CEO could talk to the CEO's employees. And so they had an open line that media could always call into to listen to certain employee calls. And they made that available so they could lead the media to getting to the truth, even though American Airlines couldn't disclose it. I hope I'm giving that fair summary from Tim Doak's work. But he won Communicator of the Year from numerous PR organizations during that crisis. The point is, set up a press room, which is a Zoom call or whatever now, but tell the truth quickly. Get out from under it. Don't try to obfuscate. Don't try to blame others. Don't try to blame the victim. Admit the mistakes and move on. And yes, that mistake will always be there, but if you've dealt with it squarely from the beginning, it won't be exacerbated over time. And I think people tend to be forgiving. I think most people, even people that choose to be misinformed or uninformed, most people, given the right set of information, will make a good decision. And if they understand the situation from a trusted source, even if it's a decision they don't like, they'll understand it. And that's a huge step in engendering trust.
Your most recent job, you talk about being at Healthline. You guys did an event with Anthony Fauci. This is all in the last couple of years here when he became a household name. I don't even know where to begin, right? In terms of the media about health, right? The pandemic, vaccines, masks, social distancing, isolations. The narrative has changed from where we were in March 2020, and even that lingering part up until that point as we were starting to figure out what was happening. You know, whether we wanted to wear masks or not, whether we should wear masks or not, social distancing or not, indoors versus outdoors, the virus is here, the virus is not here. What was your life like there? I mean, what was that like? And then talk about that, and then talk about how did you get Anthony Fauci to come do an event? He's a government official who's the most famous person in the world for a brief period of time. Why is he even doing an event with a for-profit company? How did all that work?
Well, Healthline at the end of the day is a news organization that delivers evidence-based, medically vetted information to its readers and viewers. And that's the way we positioned it. I contacted Dr. Fauci's office early in the pandemic, as soon as I saw him come onto the scene in March, April, and didn't get a response, but because I tend to be tenacious, I followed up twice a week, phone calls, emails. And sometime in July of 2020, on a Saturday morning, I got an email from his scheduling person that said he's available on this date. I don't remember what it was. I think August 15th, if I'm not mistaken. But he's available for 15 minutes at this time on this date. And it was 3 weeks into the future. So we had 3 weeks to pull together what was a live town hall. And we did a live broadcast with our chief medical officer at the time, and I hosted. And we had him for 15 minutes, but we did a 45-minute broadcast with another epidemiologist or a pulmonologist and a mental health professional who spoke about all of the ramifications of COVID-19. And then we had Dr. Fauci individually with the chief medical officer for 15 minutes. And then we had the two doctors come back in and do a short exchange with Dr. Fauci before he signed off, and we concluded the program with the two doctors. So it was high, valuable information delivered unscripted. It was live to an audience of hundreds of thousands. And we repeated it a year later in March 11th at the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic. We did another live town hall, which featured Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes, D.L. Hughley, the very entertaining commentator and comedian, Alyssa Milano, the actor and activist, and a couple of other folks that aren't household names. The key commonality, each one of them had contracted and survived COVID. So 1 year later, we did another live broadcast about how to deal with COVID in your family, how to avoid contracting the virus if you could. That was very informative. And then we did, in a couple of months later, another live town hall on the subject of mental health and how this pandemic is really affecting people's mental health. And we had numerous celebrities for that. Taraji P. Henson was one, Bershon Shaw. We had the chief medical correspondent of ABC News, and a number of other celebrities who came on to talk. Again, these were all uncompensated appearances by these people because they were talking to America's largest digital health audience. Healthline is the #1 site and the #1 brand for health and wellness information on the internet. So these people came on their own volition, without compensation, to talk to our audience and to be conveying their personal experience with COVID, or in the case of the doctors, their advice to our consumers.
What was it like for you being so in the know, in the weeds on health news, right? You knew more about it than anybody. Was it scary during the pandemic? Because it's like, oh my gosh, like you're in it every day, right? You know more than what reaches the end normal consumer, the normal user. So did that change your own personal behavior, your family's behavior? Were you out there emailing all your friends and texting, you got to do this, you got to do that? It must have been a stressful time for you.
Stressful and invigorating at the same time. You're right. It came with a huge responsibility because I do happen to know I personally talked with Dr. Fauci and I trust him. Well, I have friends who, listen to another network that say he's not trustworthy and he's just a shill, and those things that are just frustrating and angering to me because he is the nation's, if not the world's, leading epidemiologist telling us the truth about what we need to know about a virus that is killing 800,000 Americans and millions worldwide, and it's not going away soon. And so I had this empowerment of knowing facts, truth, evidence-based information vetted by the medical community. And so I think I know a little more than the average consumer. And that can be very frustrating because if the average consumer chooses to believe that it's just the flu and you get the sniffles and you have 2 Kleenexes and you're fine, that's not the case. And to try to speak with somebody like that, which I do. I was at a store recently standing in line, and there was a man with his mask around his chin. It said, "Do not obey." And I asked him, why wasn't he having his mask around his face as he is supposed to do mandated by county and state regulations. I live in California. And we got into a very robust discussion. I spoke with him just as I am now, very calmly but firmly. And he just chose to believe information that is just blatantly false. And I apologized to him and said, I just can't abide you because you're not looking at truthful information. He had his facts, just like Tip O'Neill. You're not entitled to your own facts. Facts are facts. It's an airborne disease, virus. It's highly contagious. It can take the life of somebody with a respiratory problem or other current ailment. And we have to take it seriously. And we have to mask. We have to wash our hands. We have to keep our distance, even 2 years later with the Omicron variant. And so having this wealth of knowledge from the medical community was very empowering to me, and it still continues to be, but also very frustrating because for the people who just don't care and just throw caution to the wind because they want to live their lifestyle and they don't want to have the government telling them what to do. Well, we've eradicated smallpox and polio and typhoid and a number of other illnesses because everybody in the community got vaccinated and took the public health concern first above their own. Well, it's just now the reverse with some people. And that's shocking to me. And that's the problem that I see. But problems need solutions and people find solutions. So we'll figure it out. But the damage that's going along the way is really concerning.
What do you mean by a robust conversation you had with this man? Like, what did you sound like? How robust are you talking about here? That's a great word you said.
I think just as I am right now, I elevated myself a little bit. I spoke a little faster than I like to. Probably had a louder voice than some. I interrupted him a few times. But I kept it respectful. I was smiling, but he couldn't see it. His first question to me when I asked him, I said, why aren't you wearing your mask around your face? That's how I started it. He says, "Do you think that masks actually helps you?" And my first response was, "Yes, I believe it helps me, but moreover, I believe it helps you. Because if I have the virus, but I'm asymptomatic, I don't know I have the virus, but I'm not passing it to you by wearing this mask and staying 6 feet away from you." That's how I started. And he just sneered, and he came back and he cited a source that I since looked up because I wrote it down. He gave me a source and I looked it up, and it's just a flam site that doesn't have any basis in reality. It's I won't even deal with it. It's just misinformation. It's just classic misinformation that he chooses to believe because he wants to believe. And this is, again, the problem where we've allowed ourselves to become misinformed because somebody in some position told us. We are latching on, and it's become ideological. And what we've lost sight of is the public good. And that's my big concern. How do we get back to trusting the institutions? And I promised you I wasn't going to go political, but here we go. This is how fascism starts. Fascist leaders try to manipulate a public with information that benefits them and not the greater public. And people start to believe that and they rally around it, and then you have fascism. And I started talking about this 5 years ago, and people, including my own family, said, just don't be so sensationalistic, don't be so sensitive, don't be so ridiculous. This is America. Well, we've had elements of this where individuals and a party have come forward with misinformation that has led people to make decisions that are harmful to the community, to the public good. And I'm not suggesting that we're becoming a fascist nation, but the elements are there. And if we're not very careful, it could happen. And I don't really want to go any deeper into the political.
I'll save you. My question was going to be, what about you go back a couple of years ago? Remember the beginning? It was about, hey, don't wear masks because we need to save the masks. Other people need the masks. Remember at the beginning, it was don't touch stuff. This was a touching thing, right? Don't handshake, don't pick things up. So there's been a change in the science. There's been a change in the narrative. So you could at least understand why some people say, hey, they said X at the beginning. Now they're saying Y. They said something. Now they're saying something different. How do you work as the narrative changes in such a short period of time?
The narrative changes because information changes. When you have new information, science evolves. I mean, I think about the people who built the pyramids in Egypt 3,000 years ago. They didn't have the science and the technology we have now. They still built pretty amazing structures. But if they had the science and the technology we have now, they would have built them in half the time, so they wouldn't have had to use slave labor. Point is, information evolves. With a virus that nobody knows anything about, the information evolves very quickly. Now, there were those who know that it was airborne and didn't say anything about it for a couple months, which is pretty much a tragedy in my opinion. But as the information evolved, the I don't want to name sources, but the CDC being one and the World Health Organization being another, evolved their positioning. I vividly recall the mask conversation in February, March, and it really frustrated me because if you look at any medical show from TV from the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, every doctor is wearing a mask in the surgical room. You just know intuitively, but that's true. We didn't have the proliferation of masks on the market, so they wanted to save the N95s for the medical community. That's true, but at the same time, they weren't conclusively certain, in my understanding, that it was just purely airborne. Because we were washing our bags of lettuce when we brought them home from the store. We were washing everything. We were using wipes. We still do a lot, which is a good practice anyway. But the point is, as the information evolved, the messaging evolved. And people that are sticking to old messaging because they're sticking to old information. And that's where we have to trust the institutions that are leading us and giving us what is ostensibly in the public interest.
Yeah, that trust word's a tough one. I think there's certainly a lack of trust in certain ways. There's lack of trust on multiple sides, both sides, right? Like obviously there's different agendas that are going around all over the place. So we don't need to get so deep and crazy today, but I want to ask some more fun questions. We'll lighten it up a little bit. You worked at Netflix. You were close with Reed. You helped him do a lot of what the media work that he was doing. How much is when you work at a place like that and the big growth, how much do you yourself are watching Netflix? Do you have a Netflix queue? Are you binge watching? When you're in it and you're making the sausage, is it just like you can't consume it yourself? What is that like for you personally?
Netflix was a great opportunity. I was there 7 years. I was recruited away because I wanted to lead the global organization. I was the number 2 guy at Netflix, so it turned out really well. I was able to go to another entertainment company in the mobile game space and build out its global communications function. But for 7 years, I loved Netflix. It was a dream job because I love entertainment. I ran a film society in my undergraduate years at the University of Wisconsin. It lives its product. Every meeting started with a round robin of what did you watch most recently. I mean, we did that every management meeting. 10 minutes or so was taken with the 35 or 50 or however many people in the room. I just watched XYZ and a little tiny 30-second synopsis of it. So people live the product. And when you live the product, you know you're going to do well to your consumers. When you mentioned Reed, obviously this is Reed Hastings, the co-founder and CEO you're mentioning. He's outwardly and inwardly humble. He's just a thoroughly decent guy, and he's got a brilliant vision. I don't think Reed Hastings gets the credit that he should as a brilliant visionary. I liken him to the ones you read about and hear about all the time: Bill Gates, Jeffrey Bezos, Elon Musk. I mean, these are people who are just largely
Wasn't that your
known.
job though? If you're running communications, aren't you supposed to get him all that visionary credit?
We got Reed out there quite a bit. They're right there behind me on the shelf is a cover of Fortune magazine from December of 2010, where he's on the cover as Business Person of the Year. We did that, but it's part of the positioning of the individual. Reed is humble and he doesn't want to be the focus. Netflix was always the hero. It wasn't Reed Hastings. And I told him Reed Hastings is the co-founder and the only CEO. He has to be front and center. And he resisted that. He wanted the product to get the focus. And I said, the product needs a personality early in its stage. Now the product
reporters can't ask the questions to the product. Someone needs to talk to them.
You've got to have an individual at the helm. And now, of course, Reed is sharing the CEO office with Ted Sarandos, who also, not ironically, embodies humility, integrity, and trust. A thoroughly decent guy, a smart guy, deeply embedded in the Hollywood culture. It's just the perfect match.
How does anyone do that? How can anyone in Hollywood succeed in Hollywood with humility, integrity, and trust? Because that seems like the last place on earth where those three things are going to get you far.
I suggest it's because of that. There are so many big egos and self-promoters in Hollywood. Ted's the real deal. He's honest. You know when you shake his hand, he's going to do what he said. And he's also a terrific guy. I haven't seen or talked to Ted in full disclosure in a number of years, but I worked very closely with him. We had a good personal rapport for 7 years. He is that guy who you just know is the real deal. He's not doing it for his ego or his self-aggrandizement.
What was your experience like? Because obviously Netflix has that radical transparency type of place, right? The brutally honest culture, that it's a different kind of HR vibe. Let's put it that way from other companies. What was that like? Did that filter out certain kinds of employees? Did it make it harder for you in other ways, easier? Because I never worked there, so I always hear about it. What was it like on the inside?
Well, there is the issue of sometimes it's not all it's you can't tell the book by its cover, and the cover is what you read in the popular media. Not to cast disparity on the media, because I think the media are doing a fabulous job in covering all that's coming at them. But Netflix is a very unique culture, and it's not for everybody. It is a high performance culture, and people are expected to bring their A game every day. They had a saying when I was there, I don't know if it's still there, but we hire a person to do the job of 2 or 3. And that's really difficult. Some people, and no criticism of them whatsoever, but some people want a very predictable job and they want to have a control over it. At Netflix, when you're creating something that's never been done before, there's no textbook on the shelf to pull down and open chapter 12 about how to create a streaming service when you're running a DVD by mail service, which had never been done either. So when you have these brilliant visionaries running companies that are creating a product or service that's never been done before, yeah, you've got to have some people that are willing to take risks, that people are willing to pivot, and people willing to work a lot harder than they may in a more traditional job. And so that's not for everybody. But for the people like me or other people that have been there a number of years, you thrive in it. And I loved it. And when Reed Hastings called me on a late in the afternoon, and I was in my backyard, I believe it was on a Saturday, I could have been a Sunday, but he said, we're not going to launch the Netflix box. At one point, Netflix was going to have its own box, its own streaming device, which is now the Roku box. Netflix was going to launch its own box 2 weeks before rollout. Reed changed his mind and said, we can't compete with Samsung and LG and Apple and all the other, and he was right. But we were 2 weeks from rolling out a device in the marketplace. Just think of rolling out a new product and pulling the brakes on it or slamming the brakes on it completely complete stop with 2 weeks before launch. And that's the way it was. Okay, we're not going to launch it. And we didn't. And Netflix shows now it's ubiquitous on every device worldwide. It was the right decision.
What did you say when you got that call? Were you thinking, this is going to be a pretty rough couple of weeks for me to explain this to the world?
I think my first comment was, okay, let me process this. And I think then I pushed back and said, we're so close. What if we launch it and do a 6-week evaluation? We tested everything in Netflix. And Reed said, no, we're not launching it. That's it. And I said, okay, we'll figure it out. Again, big problem, smart people, figure it out. And we figured it out. And we spun out the whole team. Anthony Wood, who was CEO of Roku before he joined Netflix, went back and became CEO of Roku again. He took a number of people. Netflix made an investment in Roku, and the Netflix box became the Roku box. And Roku, off to the races and has done extraordinarily well ever since.
If you look back on the career, what's been your least favorite job? It could be anything from the time you were 12 and older. What's just been the job that you said, this is absolutely not for me?
Well, I threw papers as a paper boy when I was a kid, and I didn't really like getting up that early. But also because the paper was one of those controlled subscriptions where people could pay if they want. It was an out-of-town paper, so nobody wanted it, and I'd have to go around and collect. And I think I was 11 years old, and I'd go and knock on people's doors and say, I'm collecting for the Livermore Independent, and we lived in Danville. And people said, I don't want that paper, and I was required to deliver it to them 3 days a week. I don't want that paper. Don't throw it on my lawn anymore. I said, I always get it on your doorstep. And 11 years old, I think that was a little bit of character developing. But I think the professional jobs I've had, the career jobs, there have been some that have been really difficult, like an 18-month hostile takeover of PeopleSoft by Oracle. That was 18 months of, the PR equivalent of hand-to-hand combat. I don't like to make a war analogy, but when you're in a courtroom, which we were in Brussels, Belgium, and in San Francisco, California, and in Wilmington, Delaware for weeks at a time, and you break from the court and you go out in the hallway and you try to get the media's attention to have an impromptu news conference, and Oracle's doing it right across the hall. That's the equivalent of PR hand-to-hand combat. And we've done that, and that's not fun. It's career building, but it's not enjoyable. But we did the right thing.
What was it like? Could you even be collegial with the Oracle counterparts that had the same job as you, or were they all of them the enemy?
We were collegial. We were on the same plane at one point. I was sitting right in front of Deborah Lilienthal, excuse me, who was my counterpart at Oracle, and we were flying to Delaware. And I got up to go to the rear of the plane, and she was standing right there. And she told me, I'm sitting right behind you, And of course, I never look at anything proprietary or confidential on an airplane or any place in public. But if I did, I would have been compromised. But we were very not collegial. We were cordial with each other. We respected each other. And in fact, we've kept in touch, and we see each other every now and then. And that's, these old war wounds heal, and you become friendly. But in the height of it, we wanted to win. They wanted to win. They ultimately won. It was a battle, but we had respect for each other. And I think that goes back to, again, the humility and the integrity and the trust.
You've done a lot. It's impressive. A lot of household brands, big names that everyone knows. The approach that you've taken, just to summarize it, humility, integrity, trust. I think a lot of people forget that when just trying to get results, right? They forget about the process and the way you do things, the small decisions that get made when no one's looking. It's impressive to see that you've survived and thrived this entire time. But I don't know what you're going to do with the challenges ahead of you, ahead of this media ecosystem. Now, you're probably happier just to be a senior advisor now rather than in the trenches every day.
Well, I'd like to be in the trenches, but I also realize time is our most precious commodity, our most precious resource. And at this point, I'm taking a lot more time with my family, and that's, that sounds so contrived. So many people say I'm taking time with my family, but I realized very recently that that's required, and relationships matter. And you can do breakneck speed for a long time, and at the end of the day with no relationships, and you are alone. And that's very sad, because you're retired. You spend your later years in life longer in some cases than you spend working, or at least as much time if you're fortunate to live to a long life, and you don't want to be alone during those times. I will say that the relationships matter piece, I have friendships professional friendships, not come over to your house for dinner friendships, but friendships with a lot of reporters that I've dealt with for years and years and years, because I've always dealt with them honestly and squarely, and they know that I'm not going to pull them off. If you're a publicist, if you're a PR person going for a quick hit at all costs, you won't have those relationships for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Mike Lidke at the Associated Press and I exchanged Christmas greetings. He's been doing it for 40 years. He and I knew each other when he was a cover reporter and I was a junior AE at a PR agency in San Francisco. And all these years, and I've pitched him many stories over the years. He's written about some of them, but he always knows I'm going to come at him with a story that is interesting to his audience and is worthwhile to him to report, not waste his time. And I think the reporters that have known me over the years know I'm never going to waste their time. And if you take it from that approach, you're going to build a long and successful career. If you're in it for the quick hit and you irritate people, and you might get the hit, but you might not be able to go back to them 6 months later, a year later, 6 years later, 20 years later, and hope that they receive you well.
Well, hopefully you receive me well, Steve. Hopefully you'll be back here in 6 months or a year or sometime in the near future. Fascinating conversation. Steve, thank you for the time. Thanks for joining me today.
Eric, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks again to Steve Swasey. Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.